The Land Question in Palestine and Eastern and Southern Africa, a comparative and historical study of two colonial tragedies by Dr. John Henrik Clarke. The land question is as old as people and nations, forming part of a global problem that must be understood in its broader context to grasp the specific issues addressed in this paper. The quest for land and the struggle to reclaim it when lost is a recurring theme in the drama of human endurance and survival. Stability on a piece of land that a people can call their own is the foundation for their nationhood, culture, religion, and ultimately their humanity. In assessing the fundamental rights of the Palestinian people, I will examine the land question through several historical lenses with a primary focus on Palestine. I will compare this issue with the land question in Eastern and Southern Africa to highlight their similarities. My intent is to demonstrate that the methods and rationales used by Europeans to seize land from Africans in the so-called White Highlands of Kenya, in Zimbabwe, then Rhodesia, and in South Africa, where the Dutch Boers encountered the Khoisan people, whom they called Bushmen and Hottentots, were fundamentally similar. Furthermore, I aim to show that the pattern of land encroachment by Europeans was part of a broader war against the cultures and customs of non-European peoples, differing only in degree across various times and places. In her PhD thesis, The Dominant Modes of Western Thought and Behavior, an Ethnological Critique, Professor Donna Richards refers to this European behavior as the concept of the cultural other. She writes, "It is in the nature of the Western ethos that one of the most accurate indices of Western man's self-image is his image of other. The essential characteristics associated with this concept within the Western worldview are control and consequently power, the theme which reverberates endlessly in the ethnological unfolding of Western culture, echoed in every Western statement of value." In another work, The Ideology of European Dominance, Professor Richards continues, "It is possible to isolate certain seminal ideas which have served as organizing principles in Western scientific thought. These themes are intimately related to the Western European attitude toward other peoples and imply a particular relationship to them, which will subsequently be referred to as ethos. The Western European ethos appears to thrive on the perception that those who are culturally and radically different are inferior. It relates to other cultures as superior or inferior, as powerful or weak, as civilized or primitive. The European worldview reflects these relationships. It was the Western European ethos that created the savage. This perspective helps us understand, at least in part, the temperament and attitude of the Ashkenazi Jews who control the part of Jerusalem called Israel. They are more European than Jewish, functioning as a European nation. Their problem, however tragic, originated in Europe by Europeans and should have been resolved there. Norman F. Dacey, in his book Democracy in Israel, highlights this dilemma. Jews in Israel don't persecute just Arabs, they persecute each other. The discrimination, which is the hallmark of the life in the Zionist state, is responsible for a widening gap between Western Ashkenazi Jews and the Oriental or Sephardi Jews. Discrimination against Oriental Jews persists in housing, jobs, and education, rendering them a subject people within Israel. These Oriental Jews, who once lived across Western Asia, the Middle East, were enticed by Zionist propaganda to migrate to Israel upon its creation. However, European Jews have never accepted them as equals, despite sharing the same religion. Oriental Jewish communities in places like Baghdad, Iraq, existed for 12 centuries before Islam's arrival, yet they have not embraced Zionism, as it was neither created by nor for them. Zionism and European colonialism. Zionism is directly tied to European colonialism emerging from the same political incubator at roughly the same time. Its racist attitudes and treatment of Arabs, Oriental Jews, and the small number of American blacks settled in Israel align closely with the Calvinist Christianity of the Boers in South Africa. Arab communities in Israel and on the West Bank are surrounded by Jewish settlements that function as armed camps designed to contain the Arabs and control the land. These communities resemble the black communities in South Africa, which the Boers call Bantustans. In both cases, the intent is to deny Arabs and Africans any sovereign rights in their own land. Whether practiced in Israel or South Africa, this system is what the Boers term apartheid. The term apartheid was coined by Boer intellectuals for the 1948 general election that brought them to power. However, the condition of apartheid predates the term, with the British playing a significant role in its establishment. The word, promising to keep Africans in their place, resonated immediately among white racialists who saw apartheid as a means to advance themselves at the expense of Africans. This condition also ensured that Africans, like Arabs in Palestine, could be made to feel alien in their own land. Palestinian writer and scholar Fayez A. Sayegh emphasizes this in his pamphlet, 20 Basic Facts About the Palestine Problem. Israel has additionally imposed a system of apartheid upon the Arabs who stayed in their homeland. More than 90% of these Arabs live in security zones. They alone live under martial law, restricting their freedom to travel from village to village or from town to town. Their children are denied equal opportunities for education, and they are denied decent opportunities for work and the right to receive equal pay for equal work. Dr. Sayegh notes that despite this, Israel is often portrayed in the Western press as a bastion of democracy and a champion of peace in the Middle East. However, propaganda cannot alter the facts. Israel was established at the expense of the Arabs, located at the intersection of three continents, geographically at the back door of Europe, the side door of Asia, and the front door of Africa. Since its inception, Israel's rulers have behaved as colonial masters, treating Arabs as colonial subjects. Sayegh elaborates in his pamphlet, Palestine, Israel, and Peace. The crux of the Palestine problem is the fate of a people and its homeland. It is the piecemeal conquest and continued seizure of the entire country by military force. It is the forcible dispossession and displacement of the bulk of the indigenous population and the subjugation of the rest. It is also the massive importation of alien colonists to replace the evicted and to lord it over the conquered. And it is the colonization by the foreign settlers of both the expropriated private land and the seized national resources of the overpowered people. It is, indeed, the destruction of the native Palestinian society of Christian and Muslim Arabs, and its replacement by a society of transplanted Jews and a foreign body politic which views itself as the vanguard of the Jewish nation, currently spread throughout the world, but declared destined sometime to assemble in the seized land. The refusal of the Arab world to acquiesce in this fate of Palestine and its people explains both the bitterness and the persistence of the Arab-Israeli conflict. It also underscores the essential difference in character between this conflict and ordinary international disputes, and it explains why the Arab-Israeli conflict cannot be resolved until the Palestinian problem is settled through restoration of the rights of the Palestinian people. There is no intent among Israelis, including liberals or communists, to fully restore the rights of the Palestinian people. While some advocate for improved living conditions, they do not support Palestinian empowerment or power sharing. The territory encompassing Israel and the West Bank remains under European Ashkenazi control. Recent slight improvements in the living and political conditions of Oriental Jews do not indicate a path to power. Nasir H. Aruri, in an article in Zionism and Racism, explains that Israel's Oriental Jews have been subjected to social, economic, and racial discrimination is no longer considered controversial. Although constituting about 60% of the population, they are less than first-class citizens. Their representation in the state's social, economic, and political institutions is strikingly incompatible with their numerical majority, while the European American, Ashkenazi, communities are represented far out of proportion to their numbers. Disabilities imposed on the Oriental sector are rampant in employment, education, housing, income, social welfare, and political participation. Disparities between the two Jewish communities have grown worse in all these areas since the establishment of the Zionist state in Palestine, and there are no indications that the social gaps are narrowing. The largest share of the national income in Israel goes to the highest strata of capitalists and managers, workers, and government bureaucrats are strategically situated to push for higher incomes. Jews of the Oriental communities have no professional skills to speak of and consequently are unable to compete in their category. Their presence is most prominently observed in the lowest strata of the socio-economic pyramid, that of the manual workers in industry and agriculture, the only group whose share of the national income has increasingly diminished. Poverty in Israel is closely linked with ethnic origin. The evidence is clear. Zionism is a form of racism. Arabs in Israel, and to a lesser extent Oriental Jews, live in conditions akin to South Africa's apartheid. Ashkenazi Jews exert near total control over their land, jobs, housing, and education. Israel Shahak, chairman of the Israeli League for Human and Civil Rights, states Israel is about as apartheid as South Africa. He highlights the difficulty Arabs and Oriental Jews face in obtaining decent housing. This isn't the only thing. If you go any place where there are so-called twin cities, like Nazareth and New Nazareth, you will see that the old Nazareth is an open city. Anyone can come and by buying or selling or by agreement can dwell there. But in New Nazareth, the so-called Upper Nazareth, to obtain a flat, you have to bring proof that you are a Jew, a society in which such a thing is required for more than 90% of its inhabited areas, has no other name than an apartheid society. Exactly the same proof is required in Johannesburg. The only difference is that people know about Johannesburg, but not about Nazareth. This goes for many other areas too. For example, you have now an official plan in Israel for what is called the Judaization of Galilee. This means that the government thinks there are too many Arabs in Galilee, so it has decided officially and openly to confiscate some of their land, convert it into pure Jewish land, and settle only Jews there. The treatment of Arabs and Oriental Jews in Israel lacks justification in Judaism or Christianity, violating the moral codes of both religions. Shahak adds, we are on a much lower level than blacks in the United States because there is no recourse. No one can even do the same sort of job that the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, does in the United States. There is no possibility of bringing any case about discrimination, even the most blatant, to any court, because in Israel, there is no law forbidding discrimination against non-Jews. On the contrary, all discrimination against non-Jews is completely legal. This failure to recognize Arabs as human beings mirrors the racist attitudes of Nazis toward Jews. Alan R. Taylor, in Looking Beyond Coexistence, Prospects of a Binational Palestine, recalls a 1967 statement by the chairman of the Knesset Foreign Affairs Committee to a UK House of Commons delegation. The Palestinians are not human beings. They are not people. They are Arabs. Golda Meir echoed this in a 1969 Sunday Times interview. There was no such thing as Palestinians. It was not as though there was a Palestinian people in Palestine considering itself as a Palestinian people, and we came and threw them out and took their country away. They did not exist. This dehumanization stems from Western racism. Israel's primary difficulty in the Middle East arises from its failure to recognize Arabs as a people with the right to live in peace in all or part of Palestine. Before Zionism, Jews and Arabs coexisted harmoniously, complementing each other at historical crossroads. The pogroms and persecutions Jews faced in Europe had no parallel in the Arab world. Early European Jewish settlers in Palestine, arriving in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, were welcomed by Arabs as a humane people escaping persecution. However, the true intentions of Zionism to colonize and take over all of Palestine were concealed. Humane Zionists advocating a binational state were marginalized or expelled from the movement. The Zionist leadership intended to establish a Jewish state as Jewish as England is English, propagating the myth that Palestine was an empty land awaiting settlers, ignoring the large Arab population. The European Jews who created Israel established a country with double standards, one for Israeli Jews and another for Palestinian Arabs. The conflict was embedded in the government structure with the primary aim of destabilizing Arab life and controlling the land. The 1951 World Zionist Congress in Jerusalem, the first after Israel's establishment, declared, "The task of Zionism is the consolidation of the state of Israel." This was a political, not religious agenda focused on control over Arab lives and land. The pamphlet, Zionism and Racism, A Case to Answer, details the discrimination inherent in Israel's framework. An Arab living under Israeli rule in Israel may be arbitrarily excluded from land which he and his forebears have owned for generations. He may have his land confiscated and handed over to Jewish settlers. He may then be prohibited from even working on that land. His whole village may be razed to the ground. 385 Arab villages in Israel have been wiped out in this way. He and his whole community may suffer gross discrimination in housing, municipal services, education, and social welfare. He may be refused nationality and citizenship, even though he was born in the territory of Israel and has lived there all his life, and even though any Jewish newcomer from anywhere in the world automatically receives Israeli nationality. Thousands of Palestinian Arabs are in this stateless condition in Israel. An Arab living under Israeli rule in the occupied territories may be arrested arbitrarily and detained without trial. He may be deported from his native land without judicial process or appeal. His home may be blown up or bulldozed on a simple order from the local military commander. His land may be confiscated for ostensibly military purposes, but in fact for the purpose of Israeli Jewish colonization. His freedom of movement may be restricted. He cannot express political opinions or engage in political activities without risk of arrest and detention or deportation. An Arab refugee living in exile whose home is in Israel or the occupied territories and who was uprooted from it in the wars of 1948 and 1967 is prevented from returning home because he is an Arab and not a Jew. And this, in spite of repeated United Nations resolutions calling on Israel to allow him to return. Meanwhile, any Jew is free to enter and settle in Israel, even though he has never seen the country before in his life. The land question has been central to the Arab-Israeli conflict from the outset and remains so. The Camp David Agreement exacerbated the conflict, further alienating the Arabs. This conflict, fully developed before Israel's Declaration of Independence on May 14, 1948, promised complete equality of social and political rights for all its citizens, without distinction of creed, race, or sex, and called on Arabs to participate in building the state. These were hollow promises. United Nations mediator for Palestine, Count Folke Bernadotte, warned in September 1948 it would be an offense against the principles of elemental justice if these victims of the conflict were denied the right to return to their homes while Jewish immigrants flow into Palestine, and indeed offer at least the threat of permanent replacement of the Arab refugees who have been rooted in the land for centuries. Bernadotte's report exposed the essence of the Palestinian conflict, but failed to sway the Zionists or aid the Arabs. Israel's Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, declared, "We must do everything to ensure that they, the Arabs, never return." The day after his report, Bernadotte was murdered by Jewish terrorists. The Arab refugee problem became an international issue described by Jewish American journalists as the moral millstone about the neck of world Jewry. Israel's defense laws, inherited from the British Mandate 1922 to 1948, were made more stringent against Arabs. In 1946, a future Israeli Supreme Court justice criticized these laws at a Jewish Lawyers Association conference in Tel Aviv. These laws contradict the most fundamental principles of law, justice, and jurisprudence. They give the administrative and military authorities the power to impose penalties which, even had they been ratified by a legislative body, could only be regarded as anarchical and irregular. The defense laws abolish the rights of the individual and grant unlimited power to the administration. Bernard Joseph, later Israel's Minister of Justice, added, "With regard to the defense laws themselves, the question is, are we all to become the victims of officially licensed terrorism, or will the freedom of the individual prevail? Is the administration to be allowed to interfere in the life of each individual without any safeguards for us? There is nothing to prevent a citizen from being imprisoned all his life without trial. There is no safeguard for the rights of the individual. There is no possibility of appeal against the decision of the military commander, no possibility of resort to the Supreme Court, and the administration has unrestricted freedom to banish any citizen at any moment." Yaakov Shimshon Shapiro, a future Attorney General and Minister of Justice, was even more emphatic. The system established in Palestine since the issue of the defense laws is unparalleled in any civilized country. There were no such laws even in Nazi Germany. They try to pacify us by saying that these laws are only directed against malefactors, not against honest citizens. But the Nazi governor of occupied Oslo also announced that no harm would come to citizens who minded their own business. It is our duty to tell the whole world that the defense laws passed by the British Mandatory Government of Palestine destroy the very foundations of justice in this land. Israel's legal system, rooted in these defense laws, has been used more ruthlessly than by the British, aimed at controlling Arab movements and land by any means necessary. This hunger for land emerged among European Jewish settlers long before Israel's creation. Fayez A. Sayeg's 20 Basic Facts About the Palestine Problem outlines the progression. Do you know that when the Palestinian problem was created by Britain in 1917, more than 90% of the population of Palestine were Arabs, and that there were at that time no more than 56,000 Jews in Palestine? That more than half of the Jews living in Palestine at that time were recent immigrants who had come to Palestine in the preceding decades in order to escape persecution in Europe, and that less than 5% of the population were native Palestinian Jews? That the Arabs of Palestine at that time owned 97.5% of the land, while Jews, native Palestinians, and recent immigrants together owned only 2.5% of the land? That During 30 years of British occupation and rule, the Zionists were able to purchase only 3.5% of the land of Palestine, in spite of the encouragement of the British government. And that much of this land was transferred to Zionist bodies by the British government directly and was not sold by Arab owners. That, therefore, when Britain passed the Palestine problem to the United Nations in 1947, Zionists owned no more than 6% of the total land area of Palestine. That, notwithstanding these facts, the General Assembly of the United Nations recommended that a Jewish state be established in Palestine, and that the Assembly granted that proposed state about 54% of the total area of the country. That Israel immediately occupied and still occupies 80.48% of the total land area of Palestine, that this territorial expansion took place for the most part before 15 May 1948, i.e., before the formal end of the British Mandate and the withdrawal of British forces from Palestine, before the entry of Arab armies to protect Palestinian Arabs, and before the Arab-Israeli War. Israel and its Ashkenazi rulers are an extension of Europe, reflected in their temperament, intentions, and arrogant, racist attitudes toward Arabs and Oriental Jews. Israel is the most westernized country in the Middle East, culturally alien to the region despite its geographic location. Oriental Jews, Arabized and integrated into North Africa and Western Asia for over 1,000 years, are likely the true descendants of biblical Jews, while Ashkenazi Jews are European creations. Historical context of the land question. To understand the conflict over Palestine and who is entitled to it as a homeland, we must briefly examine the history of Arabs and Jews. Palestine, at the crossroads of three continents, has been home to Semites since 3500 BC, a diverse people of many colors and cultures. Around 2500 BC, a Semitic branch, the Canaanites, settled in what is now Palestine. By 2000 BC, migrants from the Arabian Peninsula formed new state formations. The people now called Jews first appear as migrants from Western Asia, led by Abraham, entering Egypt when its civilization was already ancient. In 1675 BC, the Hyksos invaded Egypt, disrupting its first age of greatness. According to tradition in the Bible, 70 Jews, grouped in 12 patriarchal families, entered Egypt as nomads without industry or culture. Over 400 years, they left Egypt 600,000 strong, having adopted elements of African religion, tradition, and culture, including monotheism. Ethnically, culturally, and religiously, they emerged as an African people. Jews did not enter Europe in significant numbers until after 70 AD. It is questionable whether European Jews have traceable ethnic or cultural ties to the ancient Jews who first claimed Palestine. This claim, based on mythic evidence, raises an unresolved question. Who declared Palestine theirs without the consent of its inhabitants? For over 1,000 years, Canaanites populated the region. Around 1200 BC, Hebrews led by Moses fled Egypt, settling east of the Dead Sea. Under Joshua, they invaded Canaan, committing heinous crimes against its inhabitants, as recorded in the Old Testament. This imperialist invasion reduced survivors to servitude, marking the Jews' first takeover of Palestine. The Hebrews occupied parts of Palestine and east of the Jordan River. In 1020 BC, King Saul established their first state, followed by Kings David and Solomon until 923 BC, during which they gained experience in agriculture, urbanization, and statecraft. In 586 BC, the Babylonians ended Hebrew rule, but the original inhabitants remained. Over the next 400 years, Persians, 538 BC, Greeks under Alexander the Great, 331 BC, and Romans, 64 BC, claimed Palestine. A significant Arab migration from the Arabian Peninsula settled in Palestine in 636 AD. reaffirming their identity with the land, which persists today. From 1517 to 1917, Palestine was under Ottoman rule. Arabs were promised independence for supporting the Allies in World War I, a promise broken as colonialism and Zionism followed. This was part of European expansion beginning in the 15th century, peaking in the late 19th century, driven by the search for land, labor, and raw materials. Jews participated as Europeans, not as Jews. European expansion and Jewish involvement. When European exploration began in the 15th century, the Portuguese sought a sea route to India via the Cape, now Cape Town, South Africa. Abraham ben Samuel Zacuto, a Jew and royal astronomer for Portugal's King Manuel II, advised establishing a refueling station along South Africa's coast. Fernão Martins, a Jewish mariner on Vasco da Gama's ship, was among the first Jews to land in South Africa in 1497. Between 1492 and the end of the 16th century, nearly 500,000 Jews left Spain and Portugal. In Holland, Jews participated in forming the Dutch East India Company, which occupied the Cape of Good Hope in 1652. The Amsterdam Jewish community was involved, and by the late 17th century, Dutch Jews were principal stockholders in the company. The Dutch East India Company laid the foundation for modern South Africa, initially welcomed by the Khoisan, whom they later betrayed and enslaved. The Khoisan fought to retain their land and cattle in wars the Boers called Kaffir Wars, ultimately losing both. After the Zulu warrior Shaka's death in 1828, the British pushed the Boers inland, sparking a land war with the Zulus. The British rescued the Boers from defeat, and these wars continued until 1906. Superior European weaponry led to significant African land loss, with plans to make African strangers in their own land through artificial communities called Bantustans. In 1970, Dr. P. Koornhof, South Africa's Deputy Minister of Bantu Administration and Development, admitted, "I am afraid to say that the African males from the homelands have no rights whatsoever in South Africa. Their rights are in their own homelands, and they are in South Africa only to sell their labor." The best-known Bantustan, Transkei, was declared independent in 1976, stripping 3 million Africans of citizenship and 13% of their land. Whites, 17% of the population, control 87% of the land. Most Africans work in white-owned mines, factories, and farms, and under the Bantustan program, they are turned into foreign migrants, stripped of rights in their ancestral lands. The treatment of Africans in Bantustans parallels that of Arabs in Israel and the West Bank, explaining the alliance between Israel and South Africa. This alliance is logical within the framework of Western racism and colonialism. Both Israel and white South Africa are artificial settler states, mentally and culturally European despite their geographic distance. They face a perpetual contradiction, attempting to establish nationality in lands that never belonged to them at the expense of indigenous populations. This schizophrenia underpins the dilemmas in both regions, historical roots and global context. The dilemmas in South Africa and Palestine predate European settlement. Jews first entered history in or near Africa, taking more from the continent than they gave. Small Jewish settlements in Cape Town and other parts of South Africa emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries. On September 17, 1828, Zulu King Shaka granted Nathaniel Isaacs a large tract of land for Jewish settlement, a gesture of friendship before his assassination later that year. The discovery of diamonds and gold in South Africa elevated the economic status of Jews, who had a tradition of dealing in precious minerals. Zionist politics in South Africa, largely a 20th century phenomenon, gained international attention after the 1967 Six-Day War, prompting scrutiny of Zionism as a global political force. Between 1957 and 1967, Israel enjoyed significant goodwill in Africa, more than any other white-controlled nation. By November 1973, this goodwill eroded, with nations like Côte d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Zaire, and Liberia severing diplomatic ties. While Arab influence is often cited, the primary reason was Israel's alliance with South Africa's apartheid regime. Africans realized that Israelis in Africa were no different from other whites seeking to control the continent's resources. In Zimbabwe, the land question persists despite the peace accord between the British and the Patriotic Front. When Lobengula became king in 1870, British settlers intensified their designs on African land following the discovery of gold and diamonds. The British used missionary Reverend Moffat to secure a treaty from Lobengula, granting rights to exploit the land. Unbeknownst to Lobengula, this included establishing farms and settlements. In 1870, an expeditionary force of mercenaries funded by the British South Africa Company occupied parts of Mashonaland, later Rhodesia, evicting the Shona people without purchase. Many Africans were forced to work the land or pay heavy British taxes. White political power was consolidated through unequal land tenure and control over black labor. Marion O'Callaghan notes in From Rhodesia to Zimbabwe, land became more important for the settlers as the hopes entertained by Cecil Rhodes of vast mineral wealth receded. The result was the continuing appropriation of African land from the 19th century on. Indeed, between 1936 and 1959, according to a Rhodesian Select Parliamentary Committee on Resettlement, 1960, over 113,000 Africans were compulsorily removed from white farming areas. By 1969, 250,000 whites had legal rights enshrined in the Constitution to 44.95 million acres, while 5 million Africans had the right to 44.94 million acres. The African reserves in Rhodesia were akin to South African Bantustans. Taxes and the need for basic goods forced Africans to work on European plantations or in cities for meager pay. Education funding was similarly skewed, with 275 whites receiving the same appropriation as 6 million Africans, fueling the war for independence. In Kenya, land hunger among the Kikuyu sparked the Mau Mau uprising, catalyzing the fight for independence. The global land question. The land question in Palestine cannot be isolated from the broader international problem created by colonialism and capitalism, a European imposition on the Arabs. Despite scholarly works clarifying the historical record, propaganda and mythology about rights to Palestine persist. Many sympathetic to Israel oppose the treatment of Arabs and settlements on their land. Dov Ronan, a research associate at Harvard Center for International Affairs, wrote in the New York Times on April 5th, 1980, "I am an Israeli who does not support Jewish settlements in the West Bank, nor the opening of a yeshiva in Hebron. I personally do not claim sovereignty over Judea and Samaria on the basis of a biblical right, nor do I consider Israel's sovereignty there essential to our national security in all circumstances. Furthermore, although I would oppose any plan to redivide Jerusalem, I can envision a new administrative arrangement in the city that would address and seek to satisfy Muslim and Palestinian aspirations." Having studied the issue of self-determination in world politics, I recognize this as a right that the Palestinians must be accorded. The Palestinians should have the right, both in principle and in practice, to control their lives and not be ruled by Israelis or anyone else. If independent statehood rather than mere autonomy is what they want, I, for one, support their quest for statehood. Despite voices like Moise Menuhin, Ahad Ha'am, Martin Buber, Albert Einstein, Alfred Lilienthal, Israel Shahak, and I.F. Stone opposing Zionist treatment of Arabs and settlements, Israel's expansion continued, often justified by biblical texts. I.F. Stone writes, these contradictions now play their part in the efforts at peace in the Middle East. At one end of the spectrum, the Bible preaches justice and universal brotherhood. At the other end, it contains some of the most primitive and bloodthirsty ethnocentric teachings in human literature. So Menachem Begin, Israel's fundamentalist prime minister, and the religious parties on which he depends for a thin and precarious parliamentary majority claim that they cannot give up the West Bank because God gave it to the Jews. This can, of course, be supported from Bible texts. Indeed, if we are to go back to a literal reading of Holy Writ for guidance in the Middle East conflict, the religious ultras of the Israeli community can find much else along the same lines and in the same direction, though carried to lengths that would make even the most fanatical among them quail. It is, of course, true that in the final chapter of Numbers, God gave the whole of Canaan west of the Jordan to Israel. But if the word of God is to be taken literally, those who now dwell on the West Bank may tremble. For only 3 short chapters earlier, the Lord says, ye shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, destroy their holy places, and dispossess them. Nor is that all. Numbers 33 ends with the fiercest warning of all, if the children of Israel do not dispossess the inhabitants, I shall do unto you as I thought to do unto them. This is the harsh theology of depopulating the land to make room for one's own. Palestinian leaders in the United States argue that Israel is attempting to silence opposition to the Camp David autonomy plan by expelling or forcing Palestinian mayors in the occupied territories to resign. I.F. Stone warns us some people have been cooking up a brew that could poison the peace not only of the Middle East, but of the world. It is the duty of the American government and American Jewish leadership to use their leverage, financial and political, to put a stop to this criminal concoction before it is too late. Begin, characteristically, chose this moment to announce 10 more settlements on the West Bank. As usual, he promises these will be the last. Israel and Palestine say his opponents on the right would prefer a military takeover of the Israeli government. Only recognition of the Palestinian right to self-determination can revitalize the peace talks and avert the slide to catastrophe.